People like to say every town has its own strange stories, little whispers passed down from one generation to the next. Most of the time you hear them, laugh a bit and move on. But lately, I can't laugh anymore. Not after what happened. Not after I realized that local legends exist for a reason and maybe, just maybe, they're real. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be making a video like this, sharing something so unbelievable, I would have thought they were joking. But here I am, about to tell you something I can't explain, something I still think about every night before I sleep. It began the day I returned to my hometown, a place I thought I'd left behind for good. The town itself is small, quiet, and looks peaceful from the outside. But once the sun goes down, the air feels heavier in a way you can't put into words. People walk faster. Doors close earlier. Even the animals go silent. And if you ask anyone why, they won't tell you a straight answer. They'll just say, "You know the stories," and change the topic. These stories were the same local legends I grew up hearing since childhood. Legends I always thought were just meant to scare kids. There was one legend, though, that stood out more than the rest. It was the one my grandmother used to warn me about whenever I stayed out too late. She called it the Watcher of the Field, a shadowy figure said to appear near the old farmland at the edge of town. According to people, if you walked too close to the fields at night, you'd sense someone following you, even if no one was visible. Some claimed they heard footsteps. Others said they saw something tall, thin, and impossible to describe. But no one had proof. No recordings, no clear photos, nothing solid. Just fear. When I was younger, I never took it seriously. Even when friends dared each other to go near the field, nothing big happened. The most we experienced was cold wind or a strange rustling sound, but honestly we didn't think much of it. We were kids. Everything felt like a game. But coming back years later as an adult, the legend felt different. The silence around it wasn't playful anymore. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and strangely consistent. Everyone avoided talking about it. Even people who normally loved gossip wouldn't share their experiences. The reason I returned home in the first place was to take care of some family stuff. My grandmother had passed away earlier in the year, and her small house had been empty since then. It felt weird walking through the door again, seeing the same furniture, the same wall clock, the same faint smell of her cooking still lingering in the air. I stayed there for a few days, sorting things out, and everything seemed normal at first. But on the third night, something changed. It was around midnight when I heard a sound outside, a soft tapping like someone slowly dragging their fingers across the windows. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just branches or maybe the wind. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved from one window to the next like someone was circling the house. I froze. My grandmother's stories came rushing back in a way I didn't want them to. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. A stray cat. A bird. Anything normal. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I checked outside, expecting to see some marks or signs of an animal. Instead I saw something else. Footprints. But not regular ones. They were long, strange, and spaced far apart like whoever, or whatever, made them took unnaturally long steps. They led from the edge of the field straight to the back of the house. Then they stopped. There were no returning prints. No sign of where the figure went. It was like it vanished. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I tried to focus on packing, cleaning, and getting things ready. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I glanced toward the field from the window, I felt like something was there, just out of sight. And every night the tapping returned. Sometimes soft, sometimes louder, almost impatient. I tried recording it, but whenever I pressed record, the sound stopped as if it knew. On the fifth night, something happened that forced me to face the possibility that the legend wasn't just a story. I hadn't been sleeping much and my nerves were already on edge. Around 2 a.m. I heard a single knock, slow, hard, and deliberate, right on the front door. This wasn't tapping. It wasn't accidental. It was like someone wanted me to open the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at the door from across the room. The knocking didn't repeat. But the silence afterwards was worse. It felt like the air outside the house was holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, walking across the wooden porch. One step, another step, and then nothing. Complete silence. My heart was racing so fast I felt sick. I didn't go near the door. I didn't dare look outside. I waited until sunrise before moving from my spot. When morning finally came, I opened the door just a few inches. The porch was empty. But the footprints were back, deeper this time, as if whatever stood there was heavier, closer, more real. There was also something else. On the old wooden step, there was a small bundle of dried grass tied together with red thread. It looked like something handmade, something symbolic. Something meant for me. That was the moment I realized I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The local legend wasn't just a tale. Not an exaggeration. Not a childhood fear. Something was out there. Something connected to the stories my grandmother always tried to warn me about. And for some reason, it had come back the same week I returned. I still don't know why. I don't know what it wants. But I do know this: local legends exist because somewhere, sometime, something started them. And if you look close enough, if you listen long enough, you might find out that these old stories aren't as imaginary as you think. What happened next? Well, that's the part I'm still trying to make sense of. And it's the part you're not going to believe until you hear it yourself. Because on the final night, something actually stepped out of the field. And it knew my name. People like to say every town has its own strange stories, little whispers passed down from one generation to the next. Most of the time you hear them, laugh a bit and move on. But lately, I can't laugh anymore. Not after what happened. Not after I realized that local legends exist for a reason, and maybe, just maybe, they're real. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be making a video like this, sharing something so unbelievable, I would have thought they were joking. But here I am, about to tell you something I can't explain, something I still think about every night before I sleep. It began the day I returned to my hometown, a place I thought I'd left behind for good. The town itself is small, quiet, and looks peaceful from the outside. But once the sun goes down, the air feels heavier in a way you can't put into words. People walk faster. Doors close earlier. Even the animals go silent. And if you ask anyone why, they won't tell you a straight answer. They'll just say, "You know the stories," and change the topic. These stories were the same local legends I grew up hearing since childhood. Legends I always thought were just meant to scare kids. There was one legend, though, that stood out more than the rest. It was the one my grandmother used to warn me about whenever I stayed out too late. She called it the Watcher of the Field, a shadowy figure said to appear near the old farmland at the edge of town. According to people, if you walked too close to the fields at night, you'd sense someone following you, even if no one was visible. Some claimed they heard footsteps. Others said they saw something tall, thin, and impossible to describe. But no one had proof. No recordings, no clear photos, nothing solid. Just fear. When I was younger, I never took it seriously. Even when friends dared each other to go near the field, nothing big happened. The most we experienced was cold wind or a strange rustling sound, but honestly, we didn't think much of it. We were kids. Everything felt like a game. But coming back years later as an adult, the legend felt different. The silence around it wasn't playful anymore. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and strangely consistent. Everyone avoided talking about it. Even people who normally loved gossip wouldn't share their experiences. The reason I returned home in the first place was to take care of some family stuff. My grandmother had passed away earlier in the year, and her small house had been empty since then. It felt weird walking through the door again, seeing the same furniture, the same wall clock, the same faint smell of her cooking still lingering in the air. I stayed there for a few days, sorting things out, and everything seemed normal at first. But on the third night, something changed. It was around midnight when I heard a sound outside, a soft tapping like someone slowly dragging their fingers across the windows. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just branches or maybe the wind. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved from one window to the next like someone was circling the house. I froze. My grandmother's stories came rushing back in a way I didn't want them to. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. A stray cat. A bird. Anything normal. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I checked outside, expecting to see some marks or signs of an animal. Instead I saw something else. Footprints. But not regular ones. They were long, strange, and spaced far apart, like whoever, or whatever, made them took unnaturally long steps. They led from the edge of the field straight to the back of the house. Then they stopped. There were no returning prints. No sign of where the figure went. It was like it vanished. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I tried to focus on packing, cleaning, and getting things ready. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I glanced toward the field from the window, I felt like something was there, just out of sight. And every night the tapping returned. Sometimes soft, sometimes louder, almost impatient. I tried recording it, but whenever I pressed record, the sound stopped as if it knew. On the fifth night, something happened that forced me to face the possibility that the legend wasn't just a story. I hadn't been sleeping much and my nerves were already on edge. Around 2 a.m. I heard a single knock, slow, hard, and deliberate, right on the front door. This wasn't tapping. It wasn't accidental. It was like someone wanted me to open the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at the door from across the room. The knocking didn't repeat. But the silence afterwards was worse. It felt like the air outside the house was holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, walking across the wooden porch. One step, another step, and then nothing. Complete silence. My heart was racing so fast I felt sick. I didn't go near the door. I didn't dare look outside. I waited until sunrise before moving from my spot. When morning finally came, I opened the door just a few inches. The porch was empty. But the footprints were back, deeper this time, as if whatever stood there was heavier, closer, more real. There was also something else. On the old wooden step, there was a small bundle of dried grass tied together with red thread. It looked like something handmade, something symbolic. Something meant for me. That was the moment I realized I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The local legend wasn't just a tale. Not an exaggeration. Not a childhood fear. Something was out there. Something connected to the stories my grandmother always tried to warn me about. And for some reason, it had come back the same week I returned. I still don't know why. I don't know what it wants. But I do know this: local legends exist because somewhere, sometime, something started them. And if you look close enough, if you listen long enough, you might find out that these old stories aren't as imaginary as you think. What happened next? Well, that's the part I'm still trying to make sense of. And it's the part you're not going to believe until you hear it yourself. Because on the final night, something actually stepped out of the field. And it knew my name. The night after I found the bundle of grass tied with red thread, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the old house sounded louder, every gust of wind outside seemed closer. I kept glancing at the window facing the field, trying to convince myself that shadows were just shadows. But something deep in my gut told me they weren't. Something in the air itself felt wrong, thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I decided to go outside. Not to confront anything, but to see the field up close in daylight, to reassure myself that it was just grass and dirt, nothing more. The sun was low in the sky, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and pink. Everything looked normal, or at least as normal as a place tied to decades of whispered warnings could look. The tall grass swayed gently, birds chirped in the distance, and the wind carried a faint, earthy smell. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, trying to calm my nerves. As I walked toward the edge of the field, I noticed the footprints again. They were faint now, scattered in a strange pattern, as if whoever made them wasn't walking normally. My heart sank. I had hoped they were gone, erased by time or wind. But they weren't. They were still here, fresh, or at least recent enough to make me realize I wasn't imagining it. I bent down to examine them, tracing one with my fingers. The ground was soft, the impression deep, almost inhumanly long. It didn't match any shape I had ever seen. My mind raced with possibilities, all of them unsettling. What kind of person, or thing, could leave footprints like this? And why had it been following me? I didn't get a chance to think for long. A sudden rustle in the grass made me freeze. My eyes darted toward the movement, heart thumping like a drum. There was nothing there. Then another rustle, closer this time, and a low hum like the wind carrying a tune. But it wasn't the wind. I recognized the sound instinctively. It was deliberate, controlled, and almost mocking. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The field felt alive, as if it was breathing around me. The shadows stretched longer as the sun sank behind the trees, and I could feel a presence just beyond my vision. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind: never go too close. They watch, they know. I turned to leave, but then I saw it, or at least a glimpse of it. A tall, thin silhouette at the edge of the field, standing perfectly still. It was human-like, yet wrong, stretched in ways that made the air around it seem distorted. I froze, unable to move, feeling the cold realization that I had stepped into the story itself. This wasn't a memory, a tale, or a trick of the light. It was real. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted. Then it shifted slightly, just a small movement, and I caught the faintest glimmer of something in its eyes. Not normal eyes, too bright, too reflective, almost glowing with something I couldn't name. For a moment, the world felt completely silent, like it had stopped just to let me watch this impossible thing standing in the field. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, stepping forward with those unnaturally long legs. Every step pressed into the ground like a drumbeat against my chest. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming to turn and run, but my body refused. I watched as it stopped halfway between the field and the tree line, tilting its head as if studying me. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt wrong. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The spot where it had been was empty, the air still and normal again, except for one thing: The red thread from the bundle of grass had been laid out in a perfect circle on the ground. No footsteps, no sign of how it got there, just the circle glowing faintly in the fading light. I ran home without looking back. The house felt smaller now, almost suffocating. Every door, every window felt like a weak barrier between me and whatever was in that field. I locked everything, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark, trying to convince myself it was over, that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal. I went into town, bought groceries, and even tried to meet old friends. But nothing distracted me. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, every flicker of movement reminded me of that silhouette, of the circle of red thread, of the feeling that I wasn't alone. People around me carried on as if nothing had happened. They smiled, joked, and lived their lives unaware, or maybe unwilling to acknowledge, the things that lurked in the outskirts of their own town. It wasn't until I stumbled across an old journal in my grandmother's room that things started to make sense, or at least a little more sense. The journal was filled with notes about the field, the watcher, and the strange patterns she had observed over decades. She had written in careful, deliberate handwriting, "It comes for those who return. It watches, but it also waits. Do not try to see it fully. Do not call its name." I read those words over and over, feeling a chill run down my spine each time. My grandmother hadn't been exaggerating. She had seen it. She had felt it. And now, somehow, it had found me. That night I couldn't sleep at all. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch closer. Every sound from outside felt deliberate. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper carried through the open window, my name. Not shouted, not angry, but calm, almost patient. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I hide? Or should I face it, whatever it was, and try to understand why it had chosen me? The rational part of my mind screamed that I should leave town immediately. But another part, the part that had been curious my whole life about legends and the unknown, whispered that I needed to see it through. By the time dawn started breaking, painting the horizon in pale gold, I had made a decision. I would go back to the field. I would follow the footprints, step into the story my grandmother had warned me about, and try to uncover the truth. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know if I would come back. But one thing was clear. Local legends exist for a reason. And if I was going to understand them, I would have to face the legend itself. The field waited, silent and vast. The shadows lingered. And somewhere in that tall grass, the watcher waited too, patient and knowing. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The field wasn't just a field. I realized that slowly as I stood there at the edge, the early morning fog curling over the tall grass. From a distance, it looked harmless, maybe even beautiful in a quiet, untouched way. But the closer I got, the more I noticed details I had never seen as a child, small, almost imperceptible marks in the soil, strange patterns in the way the grass bent, and faint shapes that seemed carved into the dirt as if something, or someone, had walked there over and over for years. My grandmother had always been secretive about certain things in town. I had assumed it was just her personality, her old-fashioned habits, her love for storytelling. But now, as I traced my fingers over the marks in the soil, I realized she had been hiding knowledge, and not for nothing. She had seen patterns I couldn't even begin to explain. She had written about them, circled them in her journal, warned me in hushed tones. It wasn't superstition. It was observation. As I bent closer to examine one of the deeper impressions in the dirt, I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell me when I was a kid. Some were harmless, like the tale of a mischievous spirit who would hide a child's shoes and leave riddles behind, but others were darker. She told me about figures who could appear and disappear at will, creatures that existed in the spaces between what we could see and what we couldn't. As a child, I had taken these stories lightly, letting them fuel my imagination at night. But now, in the quiet dawn, every word came back with a weight I hadn't understood before. I realized that local legends weren't just stories, they were warnings. People in the town whispered them because they had seen something or someone or something in between. That figure in the field wasn't the only legend. There were others, the shadow at the river bend, the silent watcher of the old mill, and the whispering trees on the outskirts of the woods. Each story had its own peculiar details, its own eerie truths, but what connected them was always the same. A presence unseen but deeply felt, one that seemed to test or observe whoever dared get too close. I thought about my friends from childhood, those who had dared each other to go into the fields at night. Some laughed about it later. Others never spoke of it again. I had always assumed it was fear and exaggeration. But now I could feel the fear, the weight of it, pressing down on me in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't just imagination, it was real and it had been waiting. I took a step further into the field, careful to avoid the footprints that led deeper into the grass. Every sound, the crunch of my shoes, the rustle of the leaves, even the distant calls of birds, felt amplified. My own heartbeat echoed in my ears, loud enough to make me jump at every tiny noise. I wanted to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the house, but something pushed me forward. Curiosity, stubbornness, fear, maybe all three. As I walked, I began to notice objects scattered among the grass, barely visible unless you looked closely. Old, broken farm tools, shards of clay pots, pieces of rope fraying at the ends. Each one seemed placed with intention, not random. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a sense of ritual in the arrangement. Whoever, or whatever, had been here before me had been meticulous, deliberate. And that realization made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I remembered a story my grandmother had told me about a man who had vanished in the field decades ago. According to her, he had been searching for the same thing I was chasing now, a glimpse of the watcher. He had been found days later, disoriented and unable to speak of what he had seen. The locals called it, the field claiming him. I had always dismissed the story, but now I wasn't so sure. Every instinct in my body told me that there was something alive in this place, something that noticed every step I took, every sound I made. Then I noticed the circle of red thread I had seen the day before. It wasn't alone this time. Multiple circles were scattered around the field, some smaller, some larger, all perfectly formed and untouched by the wind or rain. They glowed faintly in the morning light, almost like they were charged with some energy I couldn't comprehend. I bent down to look closer, running my fingers over one of the threads. The texture was rough, like ordinary twine, but it carried an almost electric sensation, a subtle vibration that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I stepped back, suddenly aware that I wasn't alone. The hair on my neck bristled as a cold draft brushed past me, though the air was still. And then I heard it, a soft whisper so faint I almost doubted I had heard it at all. It wasn't my name this time. It was a warning, a single word repeated over and over in a tone that was both calm and chilling. Leave, leave. My legs shook, but I didn't move. Part of me wanted to run, to escape before I became the next person in one of those old stories. Another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries, whispered that I needed to understand, to see it through. And yet, the voice had no anger, no malice. It was patient, almost thoughtful, like it was testing me, measuring my resolve. I wanted to know more about it, to understand why it had come for me and why now. I thought about the years I had spent chasing stories, reading old books about legends, myths, and unexplained phenomena. I had always dismissed warnings as exaggeration or coincidence, but now I felt that my entire understanding of reality was being challenged. Local legends weren't just stories, they were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of truth hidden in the guise of myth. I pressed on, cautiously moving toward the largest circle of red thread, the one that seemed to radiate the strongest energy. Inside it, the grass was bent perfectly outward as if someone, or something, had been standing there, commanding the space. And for a fleeting moment I thought I saw movement just at the corner of my vision. Something shifting, dissolving into the mist, but impossible to focus on fully. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. My mind raced with questions. How long had this entity existed? Had my grandmother truly seen it every night in her final years? Had the other disappearances in town been connected to it all along? And most importantly, why had it chosen me? I paused, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me. Every step I had taken, every sound I had heard, every shadow I had glimpsed, it all felt connected. The field, the circles, the footprints, the whispers, it wasn't random. It was purposeful. And the more I realized that, the more I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I could never fully understand. A sudden gust of wind swept through the field, scattering some of the loose strands of red thread. They twirled in the air like sparks before falling silently to the ground. And then I heard it again, a sound I will never forget. Not a voice, not footsteps, but a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated in my chest, in my bones, and in my mind. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it was unmistakably aware of me. Watching. Waiting. I realized that whatever this was, it was not going to reveal itself easily. And whatever answers I hoped to find would not come without risk. My curiosity and fear collided, leaving me with a single, undeniable truth. Local legends exist for a reason. They are real. They are patient. And they demand respect. I stepped back toward the edge of the field, glancing at the distant house. I could see the morning light spilling through the windows, warm and safe. But I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. Something was calling me deeper into the mystery, something older than the town, older than my grandmother, older than any story I had ever been told. And as I looked back at the misty expanse of the field, I realized I was no longer a curious visitor. I had become a part of the story itself. And that was when I heard it again, louder this time, clearer, almost as if it were directly behind me. "You belong here." I stayed at the edge of the field longer than I intended, my heart hammering with every rustle of grass and distant bird call. Something about the place made it impossible to look away, like a painting that demanded attention, even if you didn't understand it. I realized that the field wasn't just a location, it was a crossroads of stories, memories and warnings, layered over generations. My grandmother had warned me, yes, but she hadn't told me the whole truth. I was beginning to understand that some things were meant to be seen, not explained. While I hesitated, I remembered the other legends in town, the ones I had ignored growing up. Each had a unique angle, but all shared a strange consistency. The shadow at the river bend, for example, appeared only during misty mornings and was said to lead people to something they were not prepared to face. The silent watcher of the old mill was rumored to observe intruders but never attack. Yet those who saw it often disappeared or changed in ways no one could explain. And the whispering trees in the woods? Well, people claimed to hear voices speaking in riddles, sometimes giving warnings, sometimes driving them mad with questions. I began to see a pattern, a network of experiences connecting the past and present. I remembered old news clippings my grandmother had kept, articles about strange disappearances and unexplained incidents. Some were decades old, some more recent. People went missing, sometimes for hours, sometimes for years, and they always returned different. The town had hidden it quietly, burying the truth beneath polite smiles and local gossip. And now, standing in that field, I understood that the watcher, or whatever it was, hadn't left. It had only been waiting for someone who dared come close enough to notice. I decided to try gathering more information, hoping to find perspective outside my own fear. I walked back into town, trying to act normal, and visited the small library my grandmother used to frequent. Dusty shelves and fading newspapers lined the walls, each one carrying decades of forgotten or ignored stories. As I searched, I realized I wasn't the only one who had tried to make sense of these legends. Local historians, amateur investigators, even some journalists had documented strange occurrences, but every account ended in ambiguity, leaving questions unanswered. One journal entry caught my eye. It belonged to a man named Thomas Ellery who had disappeared near the field in the 1970s. He had written about the watcher in great detail, describing its long, thin silhouette, its glowing eyes, and the strange red thread circles he had seen. He claimed to have followed the circles deeper into the field and discovered markings that didn't make sense, symbols resembling letters or numbers, but not from any language known to him. The last page was smudged with what looked like tears, and the entry ended with a chilling sentence: "It knows I'm here. It knows what I seek. I cannot leave. Not yet." Reading those words, I felt a cold weight pressing on me, as if his fear had transferred through time. I had thought I was cautious, careful, but suddenly I realized that the watcher wasn't something to approach lightly. It didn't just watch. It tested, it observed, and it pulled people into its own rhythm, bending their understanding of reality in subtle, terrifying ways. That evening, I returned home and noticed that the house itself seemed different. Shadows stretched longer than before, and even the familiar creaks and groans of the old floorboards felt intentional, like someone, or something, was pacing with me, timing its movements to unsettle me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that fear was sharpening my senses, but the red thread circle on my porch from the previous night confirmed that I was wrong. Someone or something had been here while I was away. The next day, I met with an old friend from school, someone who had always been fascinated by local stories. I wanted to know if anyone else had seen or heard anything unusual. As we talked over coffee, I learned something that shook me further. He had experienced similar encounters as a child. Not the watcher exactly, but shadows, whispers, and unexplainable phenomena tied to other local legends. He had never spoken openly about it because people laughed or dismissed him. Now, years later, he confessed that he had always felt the weight of these stories, as if the town itself was holding its secrets tight. This revelation made the situation feel bigger than me. It wasn't just my grandmother's warnings or my own fear. It was a collective memory, a shared acknowledgement of something outside normal understanding. The legends weren't just myths. They were a framework, a map of the unknown that had been carefully maintained by the town and its people. And I was beginning to see that the watcher wasn't the only figure, but perhaps the central one, the axis around which the other stories revolved. That night, the tension reached a new level. I decided to go back to the field once more, determined to understand the patterns, the circles, and the footprints. The air was colder than usual and a thin fog settled over the ground. Shadows stretched unnaturally, making familiar shapes look strange, even threatening. I moved cautiously, following the trail of red thread circles. Each one seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness, like it was alive, guiding me deeper into the unknown. As I walked, I noticed subtle details I had missed before. Tiny carvings on tree trunks, stones placed in deliberate arrangements, and even the way the grass bent. Everything suggested intention, design, and observation. Whoever, or whatever, had created this space had done so with care, creating a labyrinth that tested perception, courage, and understanding. I felt simultaneously drawn in and repelled, a mixture of curiosity and fear I couldn't control. Then I heard it, the soft whisper barely audible at first. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the sound of air shifting, moving around me. It repeated in a rhythm almost musical, observe, understand, follow. My pulse quickened and I realized I wasn't alone. The field felt alive with presence and for the first time, I understood the full weight of the legend. This was not just a figure standing in the shadows, it was an intelligence, patient and deliberate, observing every step, every choice I made. I crouched to examine one of the circles, noticing faint scratches along the edges, like symbols left behind intentionally. The patterns were strange, half letters, half abstract shapes, but they seemed familiar, triggering a memory from one of my grandmother's stories. She had once spoken about a code, something older than the town itself, left by those who had first encountered the Watcher. The idea made my stomach churn. These symbols were not random. They were instructions, warnings, and possibly an invitation. A sudden movement made me jump. Something had shifted in the corner of my vision, a shadow long and thin, moving with unnatural grace. I froze, realizing that it was closer than I had imagined, almost merging with the mist. I wanted to call out, to ask questions, but my voice felt trapped, swallowed by the field itself. The Watcher, or whatever it was testing me, gauging my reaction. I backed toward the edge of the field slowly, trying not to show fear. My mind raced with questions. Was it dangerous? Was it a god? Or was it something older and more incomprehensible than anything I had ever known? The answer didn't matter right now. What mattered was survival, understanding, and observation. And that's when I noticed a second set of footprints, smaller and more delicate, intersecting with the first. They weren't mine. They weren't from any person I had seen. Whoever, or whatever, was here, it had left a second trail, one that suggested movement, intelligence, and perhaps interaction with the Watcher. The presence of these new tracks deepened the mystery, adding another layer to an already complex puzzle. I knew then that I couldn't face this alone. There were angles I hadn't considered, subplots I had yet to uncover, and perspectives that might reveal hidden truths. The field was more than a location. It was a web of history, memory, and unseen forces. And if I wanted answers, I would need to explore every path, every shadow, and every whispered legend, no matter how unsettling. The night pressed on, fog thickening around me, and the weight of observation grew heavier. Every step felt deliberate, every movement calculated. And somewhere in the darkness I felt it, patient, watching, waiting for me to act. The Watcher was close. And I was no longer just a curious visitor. I was part of the story itself. The following days became a blur of unease and restless investigation. I couldn't stop thinking about the field, the Watcher, and the red thread circles. Even during mundane activities around town, my mind wandered to the patterns, the footprints, and the whispered warnings. I started speaking to people I had never spoken to before, elderly neighbors, shopkeepers, anyone who might remember strange occurrences from years past. Many of them hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, giving vague answers. Some whispered about incidents best left alone, while others outright denied anything unusual ever happening. It was as if the town itself was caught between acknowledgement and fear. One neighbor, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Langley, finally let me in on something that chilled me to my core. She told me that the Watcher was never alone. She had grown up hearing of a group of entities tied to the land, each appearing under different circumstances. Some to test, some to guide, some to punish. The stories were fragmented, overlapping, and often contradictory, but the message was clear. The field, the rivers, the woods, they were all thresholds, spaces where the boundary between the seen and unseen thinned. She insisted that my grandmother had understood this, had seen the network of presences in her lifetime, and had quietly tried to shield me from them. Her words echoed my own observations. The red thread circles, the scratches in the dirt, the smaller secondary footprints, they were all evidence of interaction, of a system in place that had rules and consequences. But no one could articulate the rules fully. And that ambiguity, the unknown, was what made the legends so potent, so terrifying. I began mapping what I knew. The Watcher's movements, the placement of thread circles, the locations of other legends. I started drawing connections that weren't immediately obvious. Patterns emerged. The Watcher seemed to favor early morning or late evening, times when shadows were longest and the world was quieter. The smaller footprints, often intersecting with its own, suggested that it either left guides for people or that there were previous participants who had wandered too close. My own footprints, I realized with unease, were now layered on top of this centuries-old pattern, adding me to the ongoing story. Subplots began to emerge in my investigation. One involved Thomas Ellery, the man from the 1970s. I discovered he hadn't just disappeared. He had left behind cryptic sketches, diagrams of circles, and fragmented notes that suggested he had tried to communicate with the Watcher, or understand it. Some of the notes mentioned a second presence, one that was smaller, almost human, but impossible to locate fully. I began to suspect that the Watcher might not be solitary at all, that it worked in tandem with other unseen entities. Another subplot involved the townspeople themselves. Some of them had seen the Watcher, some had avoided it, and others seemed to carry silent knowledge. A local handyman, Mr. Collins, mentioned that as a boy he had once seen a figure like the Watcher on the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He hadn't spoken about it for decades, fearing ridicule. But he described a strange sensation, a pressure in the air, a feeling that the entity knew him intimately, that it was aware of not only his presence but of his thoughts. His story mirrored mine in eerie ways. Meanwhile, the field continued to call me. Every day I passed it, I felt the pull, subtle but persistent. One morning I returned and found new anomalies. Twigs had been bent into symbols, patterns I didn't recognize but somehow felt meaningful. The grass bent toward the thread circles, forming almost invisible pathways leading deeper into the field. I noticed faint carvings in the bark of an old oak, marks I hadn't seen before, and suddenly realized the Watcher had been orchestrating this environment for decades, shaping it deliberately to test, guide, or warn those who entered. Night fell heavy and thick over the town, the sky a dark canvas pierced by faint stars, but down in the field, even the light of the moon seemed swallowed by mist. I stood at the edge once more, my breath visible in the cold air, the red thread circles faintly glowing like silent beacons. Every instinct screamed that I was about to cross a line, that something in this place had been waiting, patient and calculating, for the exact moment I stepped deeper into its domain. The field looked almost alive. The grass shifted, subtly, as though a hidden wind carried a rhythm of its own. I could hear faint whispers curling through the mist, fragmented words, syllables half-formed, impossible to fully grasp. My pulse raced. Each step I took toward the nearest circle felt heavier than the last, as though gravity itself had grown denser, pressing down not only on my body but on my mind. The Watcher was close, I could feel it. Not as a figure in sight but as a presence, tangible in the air, moving with patience and intent. The red thread circles led deeper into the field, forming a strange path, a maze designed to test, confuse, and draw me further in. And with every step I became more aware of the secondary footprints, smaller, lighter, weaving around the larger ones. Someone, or something, was moving alongside it, always just out of view, shaping the environment in subtle ways that I couldn't yet understand. As I progressed, the mist thickened, curling around me, hiding familiar landmarks and making the field feel endless. Shapes shifted in the corner of my vision, branches, shadows, the tall grass, but every time I turned to look, they vanished. My mind wavered between focus and fear, between logic and the creeping suspicion that I had become part of the legend itself. The Watcher wasn't just observing me, it was orchestrating the entire environment, pulling me deeper into its web, testing my resolve and my perception. I stumbled upon another red thread circle, larger than any I had seen before. Inside, the grass was bent outward in perfect symmetry, and faint scratches lined the edges, symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus. I crouched to study them and my vision flickered. For a brief moment I thought I saw a shape standing at the center, but when I blinked it was gone. My heart pounded so hard I was certain it would betray me. Then the whispers grew louder, forming phrases that felt deliberate. Closer. Observe. Understand. Do not turn away. The voice, or voices, were layered, echoing through the mist. Some seemed familiar, almost human, others hollow and alien. I realized I wasn't just being tested physically, I was being tested mentally and emotionally. Every instinct, every memory, every fear was being weighed. I moved cautiously to another circle, noticing that the smaller footprints were now converging with mine, guiding me subtly. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, was ensuring I followed the intended path. Part of me wanted to turn back to escape, but another part, a stubborn, reckless part, pushed me forward. Curiosity had become compulsion. I had to know, had to see, even if my mind screamed that I shouldn't. A sudden movement to my left made me freeze. Tall shadows shifted in the fog, too deliberate to be wind. A shape, long and thin, moved with impossible grace, halting just out of focus. The hair on my arms stood on end. I dared not breathe too loudly, afraid that sound alone would betray me. And then I realized something that made my stomach twist. The shape wasn't alone. Faint glimmers suggested multiple presences, moving in the mist, each following its own rhythm, each observing me. I thought about the stories I had collected, Thomas Ellery's journal, my grandmother's notes, the whispers of townspeople who had seen glimpses decades ago. Every account pointed to the same truth. The Watcher and its companions weren't malevolent in the way a human could be, but they were patient, deliberate, and incomprehensibly intelligent. The field was a stage and I was the main actor, performing without a script, judged on every thought, every hesitation, every step. As I reached the center of the largest circle, I felt a shift in the air. A cold, almost metallic tang filled my nose. The mist thickened around me, swirling unnaturally, and I caught a faint outline, tall, thin, impossibly still. My pulse hit a rhythm I couldn't control. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, but no sound would leave my lips. The presence was close, almost merging with the fog, yet I couldn't see it clearly. I thought about the other layers of the legend, the secondary footprints, the smaller presences, the whispers. They had been building toward this moment, weaving around me, preparing me. The Watcher had orchestrated every encounter, every observation, every step I had taken over the past days. The tension coiled tighter in my chest. I realized with stark clarity that the climax of this story wasn't just about facing the Watcher physically, it was about surviving the weight of observation, the test of perception, and the emotional pull of the unknown. Then the whispers shifted, almost impatiently, "Do not turn away. Step forward." My legs felt like lead, but instinct pushed me. I knew that hesitation might have consequences I couldn't yet comprehend. The mist moved in waves around me, forming illusions that hinted at movement, figures, and shifting shapes. Each illusion was almost tangible, almost real. My mind strained to differentiate what was physical from what was projected, and I realized the field was as much a test of thought as it was of courage. I noticed something else, a faint glow, distant, moving subtly. Red thread circles shimmered as if alive, marking pathways I hadn't seen before. The smaller footprints intertwined with mine more deliberately, almost urging me forward. It became clear that this was a coordinated effort, a layered test, and I had unknowingly accepted the challenge the moment I stepped into the field. The mist grew thicker still, curling around me like fingers. Shapes loomed and receded at the edge of perception, whispers layered with almost human cadence. I could sense the Watcher and its companions moving closer, but every movement remained just out of focus, heightening the tension. My heart pounded in my ears, sweat prickling on my neck despite the cold. Every instinct screamed both to run and to stay, to resist and to obey. Then I heard it, the clearest sound yet. A long, low hum vibrating through the ground, through my bones, through my mind. It wasn't a threat, not directly. But it was an undeniable presence, commanding attention, drawing me forward. The red thread circles pulsed faintly in rhythm with the hum, guiding me to a point deeper in the field. Every step toward that point tightened the suspense, every inhale became a question I couldn't answer. I realized then that this was the threshold, the moment before revelation, the climax that had been building through every observation, every encounter, every whispered story. The Watcher and its companions were close, unseen yet undeniably present, testing my courage, my perception, and my understanding. I stood on the edge of the unknown, the weight of generations of legends pressing down, the field alive with intention, and I knew that what came next could change everything, or consume me entirely. And then, just as the mist swirled thicker and the red thread circles pulsed brighter, I felt the first unmistakable movement from the Watcher itself. Right behind me,